Hello and welcome back. I'm really glad you're here. Just like with week 3 of summer camp, my recording for week 4 of summer camp ended up being pretty long. So this episode covers the first 2 days of week 4 of summer camp. And then next week, I'll be back to talk about the second 2 days of week 4 of summer camp. We had a lot of the same kids that were here in June, but we always have new kids as well. So this week we had a couple new kids, including a student that was at Starfish about 4 years ago and came back to spend a week of camp with me during week 4, which was really amazing. It's really cool to see kids a couple years later and just see how things are different. That always makes my heart really happy. This week, the kids in general were a lot chattier than in previous weeks. You know, everybody's personality is just a little bit different. And so sometimes I have kids that are a little more shy, a little more anxious. And sometimes I have kids that are really outspoken and outgoing, which doesn't mean they're not anxious. I've talked about social anxiety before and how it can present differently. But this week, I just had a lot of chatty kids, which is really awesome because it gives us a lot of different things to talk about and to work on together. It reminds me of one time many years ago when I was at a marketing event for Starfish Social Club, and a parent came up to me and asked about what I do. And she said, "Oh, my daughter doesn't need this. She's really social." And she pointed her out to me, and I noticed her. She's probably about 16, 15, talking to some other people her age. And I could tell just by watching that they did not want to be talking to her. And at no point was she recognizing that. She was monopolizing the conversation. It wasn't actually a conversation. It was just her talking at them. So I think our kids who are more chatty, sometimes we mistake chattiness for social skills when actually sometimes these students have poorer social skills than our kids who are more quiet and reserved. So it just gave us the opportunity to work on a lot of different things this week, some of which had not come up before because the dynamics of the group have been different. One of the first things I noticed is that the kids can come in early and have lunch together if they choose to before camp starts. And so usually about half of the kids do. One of the kids who I've talked about before, he really likes to ask people questions, but he doesn't always listen to their answers. And him asking questions is almost like a way to address his own anxiety. So instead of just being anxious, he'll ask people questions, but it sometimes turns into interview mode. What I noticed on Monday is that a student who was new came in and started asking him questions during lunchtime. And the kiddo who's used to always being the one asking the questions didn't know how to answer someone else's questions. That was really interesting. He's so used to being the one asking, but also because he doesn't always listen to the responses and he doesn't always know how to turn that into a reciprocal conversation, he did not really know how to answer this kid asking him questions. That was really interesting. So we talked about that and worked through that. I also always make a point of pointing out when it becomes clear through conversation that students have something in common with each other. And I think I talked about this in a previous week as well, because commonalities is where once we know we have something in common with someone, that can always guide our future conversations together. And so I did that a lot on Monday since we had a different dynamic when the kids were having conversations together, pointing out the things that were similar. even, we talked about how many of us like chicken because most of the kids had brought chicken for lunch that day, which led to a conversation about other things we like to eat and don't like to eat. We talked about, since we had a break, if anybody did anything over the break. And it turns out there were two kids there on this week that both had just come back from cruises to Alaska. Not together. They've never met each other. But how cool is that? That they both had just come back from being on a cruise to Alaska. And so those two didn't really connect over that, but they both connected to other students talking about traveling, whether it was places they've been. There's a lot of interest in airplanes, just different things like that. Even, the food that they ate while they were there. One of the things that happened still during lunch on Monday is one of the kids who has been there at camp for most of the summer. He's also usually one that starts conversations. And when he came in, the kids were already engaged in conversations. And I think he didn't quite know how to interject himself into those conversations. And so he started being silly. He started singing. He started just kind of playing around and being silly. And at one point, one of the kids said that it was awkward. He kind of looked at him and he went, awkward. So sometimes when our kids don't know how to interject themselves into a situation, they will do things like this just to try to get other people's attention. But being silly when no one else is being silly is not a great way to try to get social attention, because exactly what happened is exactly what will happen. Sometimes people don't say it out loud, they just think it. Sometimes people give each other the look like, who's this kid? So he did notice when someone said that, and he stopped being so silly. And I do have in our year-round program, conversations is everything we talk about in January through March. And one of the first things that we learn is how to join a conversation that's already happening, because that's exactly what this situation was. The other kids were all already talking, and this kiddo did not know how to integrate himself into that situation. He's used to being the one to start a conversation, which actually, in my opinion, and I talked to the kids about this in January, I think starting the conversation is harder than joining a conversation. But I also think for some of the kids, this has become what they're used to, is starting the conversation, and they just don't have the experience or the knowledge to join. But once they learn how to do it, then it will become easier for them to do. When we went to the playground, which is the first thing that we do, I noticed that the students naturally ended up dividing themselves into 3 groups. I never really know who's going to connect to each other. Sometimes I predict, sometimes I guess, and I'm not always accurate. So I really love just observing who gravitates toward each other. And so the kids just naturally ended up in 3 different groups on the playground. And I thought it was really interesting. It wasn't necessarily who I would have thought would have gravitated toward each other. During the activity part of camp, which is after we come back from the playground, I have 4 different activities that we'll do. We'll do one of them each on a different day. And I always mix up the days so that it's not the same. And I love to keep the kids on their toes, so they never know what we're going to do for the activity. And some days I don't decide until I see who's there and I see what the dynamics are like. I decided on this Monday that we would do a building activity. And what I noticed, because I had seen these kids kind of go into groups together, what I did for the building activity is we do Legos for our building activity. And I had the kids choose a group. I said, you can choose a group of 2 or a group of 3. And then I let them choose, and they chose the same kids that they were on the playground with. And I pointed this out to them. I talked to them about how I had noticed that you guys were hanging out on the playground together, and you guys were a group on the playground together, and you guys were doing this thing on the playground together. And they all thought that was pretty cool too. They recognized that, yeah, they were playing on the playground together, and now they had chosen each other to be in a group with for Legos. What I did for Legos is I had each group go into a different room, and the challenge was for them to pick a theme that they all wanted to build around, but to not tell the other groups. So they all chose a theme, and then everybody in the group could build whatever they wanted as long as it adhered to the theme. And then when we were done, each group got to show the rest of the kids, and they had to try to guess what that group's theme was. For example, one group did transportation. So they all built vehicles. One group, I think, specifically did airplanes, I think. And then one group did people. So they just used a bunch of the Lego minifigs. This was really interesting because you can see everybody's different communication styles. You can see who the kids are that want to be in charge of everything. You can see who the kids are that don't know how to communicate with a partner. It's really interesting just to see everybody's communication styles. One of the things that I noticed is one of the groups, which was two older students who both are pretty quiet, pretty laid back, they weren't really making anything. So I asked them about it. It's always an option to participate. Nobody ever has to do anything. So if they chose not to participate, that's totally fine. When I asked them about it, one of the students said he doesn't really like building. He's not really good at building, and he couldn't figure out what to build. This was the group that had chosen transportation. I think the other student felt the same way. He does sometimes tend to get a little overwhelmed with things that require some thought and some processing and some planning. So he had kind of created something, but it wasn't really anything. And the other student hadn't created anything. When we stopped to have everybody share what they had made, and they held up what they had made, the student who didn't make anything, this was his group, the two of them, he said, when everybody tried to guess what it was, he ended up telling the group that they chose the theme of transportation and that they had made, I can't remember, a crane that they had made. It was basically the other student had just built something tall. And so he told everybody that it was a crane. So on the spot, he made something up, which is an amazing skill. It's an amazing skill to be able to improvise like that, because otherwise both of them would have felt just really awkward and uncomfortable. And so on the spot, he made up that they had built a crane. And I thought that was a really amazing save for his group. Let me see what we did next. When we got to game time, I did notice that one of the kids was trying to kind of manipulate the game, basically cheating, but in a way that he realized the other kiddo wouldn't notice or wasn't paying attention to. So I did call him out on that. I also realized this kiddo really likes to win. He really likes to be in charge. He likes for things to go his way. Some people might refer to that as control issues. To me, that's all anxiety. Control issues to me are anxiety. They are one and the same. And so I noticed throughout the week that this kiddo, everything was a competition to him. And so losing wasn't really okay. Being a color he didn't want to be wasn't really okay. So he was cheating in the game to try to win. When I pointed it out to him, he stopped doing it. But a lot of our students are susceptible to things like that. because they're just not always paying attention. They're not always noticing what's going on. And they don't typically think that someone will do something like that. A lot of our students don't typically think that someone will lie or cheat or steal, just, to throw them all out there. And so they're typically not looking for it because however each student's brain tends to operate, that's how they think other people's brains operate. So if your kiddo or your student doesn't cheat in games, they don't expect that other people do either. They probably don't even think about it. The same with lying. If your kiddo or student doesn't lie, they typically don't realize when other people are doing it because it's just a very different concept than what their brain is used to processing. I did have a student this week that was pretty reactive to things, even things that were accidental. So somebody, when we do marbles at the end of the day, somebody had grabbed some marbles that were in front of his marble tower and he yelled, hey. One day this week, somebody had knocked down something that he and his group were building. And again, he just has that very reactive, hey. So just really working with him this week on, number one, that reactivity doesn't solve anything. It doesn't keep what happened from happening. It just makes him more upset and the people around him more upset because now he's being loud. He definitely understands it from a logical perspective, but it's now a habit. And so I am very aware that it will take a while for him to form a new habit of not reacting that way. So we worked on it multiple times during the week because it happened multiple times. But when we all have habits that we've been doing, even for his case, maybe 6 years, it's hard to form a new habit and just stop doing that thing. So it's definitely something that I'm curious. I'll see him again for week 5, and I'm curious to see if we've been able to make a little bit of headway with it. It's just something that takes reinforcement and practice. There were times this week where some of the kids were not always friendly toward each other. One example that happened toward the end of the day on Monday is one of the students was talking about a certain game console, and some of the other students were just not being very friendly about it. So he was trying to talk about it, and one of them was like, yeah, that one's stupid. I don't have that one. And then the kiddo who was trying to talk about it said, well, it's my favorite one. And then the other kid said, so we did have multiple conversations this week about how it is always okay to not agree with somebody else. It's okay to not want to talk about what somebody else is talking about. All of that is always okay, but we don't ever need to be disrespectful to another person. That's never necessary. We don't ever need to be disrespectful to somebody. We can choose to not engage in that conversation. We can even say something like, I'm not really interested in talking about that. We don't ever need to choose to be disrespectful to another person. That was something that came up a few times this week, just because we had different personalities. Every week it's a different dynamic. And so it gives us the opportunity to talk about and work on different things. On Tuesday, one of the things I noticed from one of the kids, this is not his first week, but I hadn't noticed this when he was there previously in June, is that I think he was wanting to start a conversation. And I talked a couple weeks ago about kids talking into the void, meaning they just start saying something. They're not talking to anybody specifically. They're just maybe trying to start a conversation. And so they're just talking into the void. And this is what he was doing, but he wasn't finishing his thought. It was like as soon as he realized he was saying it out loud, he would stop. So he would say something like, remember last week when, and then he would just stop. I feel like he wasn't recognizing that he was saying it out loud until somebody gave him attention, if that makes sense. Just like how sometimes little kids don't understand the concept of reading quietly, reading to themselves. A lot of our kids do this much longer than neurotypical kids. Just they don't get the concept of reading silently. And so a lot of our kids will continue reading out loud, sometimes years longer than other kids, because that concept just doesn't make sense to them. It's the same with talking. I have a lesson, I think it's in the August through October module that's coming up in a month, about talking to ourselves out loud. We all talk to ourselves. Everybody does it. But when we do it out loud, number one, it's confusing to people because they think that we're talking to them if they can hear us. And number two, it's just a little bit weird, to be honest. So we talk about how if you don't quite get the concept of talking to yourself in your brain, you can start by whispering to yourself. This is an intermediate step. If you don't quite get how to do things in your brain, same can apply for kids who are trying to learn how to read quietly. They can start by whisper reading. So that's what I'm going to work on with this student, is being able to whisper things, because at least then people don't think he's talking to them. I also noticed he would do this a lot. He would start sentences with remember when, or remember that day, or remember that kid. And it's just his way of trying to start a conversation. It actually reminded me, there's an Saturday Night Live skit. I haven't watched that show in years, so it's very old at this point. But I think it was somebody famous. I think it was a musician. And oh my gosh, it was Chris Farley. That tells you how old it is. Chris Farley. And he was playing somebody who was interviewing this musician. And the whole interview was him saying, remember in that song when you sang this lyric? I think it was a musician or an actor, one of the two. Or remember in that movie when you did this thing? That was the whole interview, was Chris Farley starting every question with, remember? And then the person just being like, yeah, I remember. So that's what it reminded me of. You can definitely start conversations this way, just not all the time, because otherwise it turns into a Chris Farley sketch. On Tuesday, there's so many little cool things that happen. The kiddo who was trying to talk about the gaming system on Monday that the other kids didn't really want to talk about, he mentioned it again on Tuesday, and a different kid jumped into the conversation and made a related comment about it. And that kid looked at me and he got kind of excited, and he said, oh, you like is Nintendo Switch. Oh, you like Nintendo Switch? And the other kid says, yeah. And he said, oh, that's my favorite. And I was like, look, now you guys have something in common to talk about. So it went from Monday, some of the other kids being a little bit disrespectful and not really caring about it, to Tuesday, now he found another kid that he can talk to about it, which is kind of always the goal in conversations, is finding other people that we have similar interests to, that we can talk to about the things that we care about. On Tuesday, I really noticed that there was one student in particular who he's a very chatty kid, but in his conversations with other kids, he was either trying to one up them, or he was trying to negate what they were saying, or he was trying to say something else that he thought was better. Or he's trying to correct them. He was not having conversations with other people that were genuine social interactions. This is the same kid who always wanted to win and always wanted to be first. Also noticed he always wanted to be the first one out the door. He always wanted to be the first one up or down the stairs. Everything in his world revolves around I'm just going to say winning. And again, to me, this is 100% anxiety. When I noticed that this was happening in his conversations, I thought, gosh, this is a really quick way to not make friends, right? Is to make other people feel like the things they're talking about are stupid, don't matter, aren't important, aren't as cool as you. Like, this is a good way to not make friends. So I was thinking about what kind of activity can we do today? How can I integrate this into an activity today? What we did was when we got back after the playground, I had everybody sit around the table. We happened to have a table. It was already in the space when I rented it this summer, and it's been perfect because it perfectly fits the number of people that we have this summer. So everybody sat around the table and I introduced them to this new game that I just made up. And what we did was I gave everybody in the group, including me, 4 minutes to talk about anything they wanted to talk about as long as it was appropriate. So they could talk about their favorite hobby, something they know a lot about. They could talk about anything. And for those 4 minutes, the challenge for everybody else in the group was to listen and to make related comments and ask related questions. And I turned it into a game. So it was +1 point for a related comment, +2 points for asking a question, and -2 points for anybody saying actually, for anybody trying to one up, for anybody trying to correct anything that somebody else was saying. Any of that stuff was -2 points. Everything else, a comment was +1, and a comment could be something as simple as, that's cool. That it can be that simple. Or asking them a question, which was 2 points, because a question is harder than making a comment. Again, kids can always pass. They don't have to take a turn if they don't want to. So I had 2 students who chose to pass and not take their 4-minute turn, but everybody else, including me, took our 4 minutes. And what I realized is that the kiddo who always wants to win, the one I actually made this activity for, was trying to win. So he was overwhelming the group by asking questions and making comments. So then I changed the rules and I said, I'm not going to tell you guys how many points you have, but the goal is for everybody to have 10 points by the time we're done. So that really just means asking a question or making a comment twice per student who takes their turn, because not everybody was taking a turn. And then at each time after somebody took a turn, I would let everybody know who had already gotten 10 points. And that kiddo every time wanted to know how many points he had. And I just wouldn't tell them. I wouldn't show them the paper. I just wouldn't talk about it. And I kept saying, it's not a competition. It is not a competition. And we had that discussion too. Nothing here is a competition. Absolutely nothing. It's not a competition to see who gets down the stairs first. It's not a competition about who wins games. Nothing here is a competition. Absolutely nothing. You don't win anything for winning anything. So that activity went really well. There was one student who didn't participate at all, but I know him, and I think it went too fast for him. I think he's the same kiddo who, when he asks people questions, he doesn't usually listen to their answer. And so I think he was too busy listening and he couldn't do both. He couldn't listen and think of something to say at the same time. So we may do this game again on week 5, really because I want him to be able to participate in this activity too. This activity is just as valuable for him as it was for the kiddo who's always trying to one up everybody, just for very different reasons. So he's the only kiddo that didn't get his 10 points. But instead of ever saying that, I just said the names of the kids who did get their 10 points. And then we just all moved on. When we do game time, sometimes I let the kids choose their own groups and partners. And sometimes I have different ways that I ask them to pair up or partner up. And I don't remember what I did on this day, but 2 kids who ended up partnering kind of decided they didn't really want to play together. And so I just waited to see what they would do, because the expectation is if you want to do magnetic tiles and marble towers before we go home, you're in a group playing a game during game time. One of the kids, who is actually only his second day, when I reminded them of that, he went and joined another group. I thought that was a great solution. He just went and joined another group. So even on day 2, just to be able to figure that out was a great solution. Another strategy I really like to use, especially when I'm talking about things that may have a consequence, is letting the kids finish my sentences. On this day, there were 2 kids were arguing about what color they were going to be. There was also, I think, another day this week where one of the groups was just being really loud playing their game. They had made up a game. They were just being really loud, but we're in an office building. So we have to be mindful about how loud we are. And so I'll just say something like, for the kids who are arguing, I said, do you guys can continue playing together as long as, and then I just waited. And then they filled in the blank, right? Like sometimes it's, they'll play pretend with a game that has these little squishy balls, and they know the end of that sentence. The end of that sentence is, as long as we're not throwing the balls. Absolutely. So I don't remember exactly what it was on Tuesday, but you guys can play together as long as, and then they said something like, as long as we don't argue, or, something like that. And then later in the week, it was, I think I said, how can you guys play this game without being so loud? What could you do differently? And they chose to go to another part of our space where there's not anybody. It's it's the back part of our space, but there's not anybody on the wall next to it. So that was a great solution. Instead of me telling them what to do, I'll just ask them. It's same thing when we go out the door to go to the playground, okay, when we go out the door, what are we going to do? And they'll say, we're quiet until we get outside. So if I tell them, they're not always listening, right? Everybody who has kids and students knows this. If you tell them something, they're not always listening. But if you ask and have them finish it, they're paying attention. And sometimes they say something different than what I was thinking. Sometimes their answer is completely different. And I think that's awesome. We did have a big conversation on Tuesday about this is something that I cover in the March through May part of our year-round program, which is all about relationships. And this is something that's pretty new to most of the students. This is not something that they had ever really thought about before. I asked everybody in the group, I think on this day, if I'm remembering correctly, when we come back from the playground, we take 5 minutes and we just chill out. I turn on some calming music. They can lie down or sit down. We turn the lights off and we just chill out. Number 1, it's our transition from running around on the playground. And number 2, it's hot outside. So it's just it's literally a cool down period. So everybody just finds somewhere to sit down or lie down, and we're all just quiet. It's about 5 minutes. One of the kids was sitting by one of our internal doors, and he was kind of pushing on it with his foot, and it was creaking. It was making this creaking noise. And so one of the other kids asked him to stop, and he just didn't. He kept doing it. So the other kiddo asked him to stop again. He kept doing it. A different kid got up and went and started pushing against the door as like a counter force to this kid's foot. And this kid would not stop. It just turned into like almost a yelling match, but we didn't quite get there. So I had everybody sit down and we had a conversation about how anytime we are acting a certain way toward another person and we're in a group, everybody in that group is noticing that. So it's not just this other person that you're ignoring or that you're yelling at or that you're calling a name, whatever the case may be. Everybody in the group is paying attention to what's happening, and they're filing that in their social memory. So I asked the kids, I said, raise your hand if it's important to you for people to think that you're smart. everybody in the group raised their hand. It's a really big one, especially really for everybody in the world. But I don't think I've ever had a kiddo say no to that in the years that I've been doing this. So then I say, raise your hand if it's important to you for other people to think that you're friendly. And in this group, everybody raised their hand. Sometimes when I ask this question, not everybody raises their hand because to some kids, that's not a priority to them. But in this group, everybody raised their hand. And then I said, raise your hand if it's important to you that your friends are smart. In this group, everybody raised their hand. That's again, for this question, usually not everybody raises their hands, but in this group, they did. And then I said, raise your hand if it's important to you that your friends are friendly. And everybody raised their hand. So I said, which is more important to you, that your friends are smart or that they're friendly? And I have to say, I was surprised by how quickly I heard all these voices saying friendly, like immediately after I finished my sentence, and everybody said it. But it surprised me how quickly they said it. So we had a conversation about that, about how when we think about ourselves, we often try to put out that we're smart. That's what we want people to think about us, that we're smart. But what other people want to see is that we're friendly. And so we talked about, what does friendly look like? All right. Friendly looks like listening to people when they're giving you feedback. Friendly looks like speaking kindly to other people. Friendly looks like not doing things that you know bother other people. Friendly looks like being helpful to other people, holding the door, saying please and thank you, whatever. But just helping kids recognize that everyone in the world is looking for people who are friendly. And so if we are not coming across as friendly because of the choices that we're making, we're going to have a hard time making friends and getting along with other people. So we had a really great conversation about that on Tuesday. Tuesday was really a good day for kind of doing some hard work, really talking about a lot of important, difficult things. And these conversations never save the world. We're not changing anything in a day, but my goal is always to plant seeds. I want to plant seeds in my kids' brains so that the next time we have a similar conversation, they remember and they can relate it to the conversation we've already had. Thank you for being here. And I'll see you again next week when I talk about the second part of week 4 of summer camp. I'll see you then.